Friedrich Nietzsche was a fascinating individual who was taken away from us at an early age, relatively early age, so we didn't get as much from him as we would have liked. But at any rate, he's become a very popular figure in philosophy and very influential, especially in terms of the existentialist movement. Well, he was a brilliant child, born to a Lutheran minister and his wife. Unfortunately, Nietzsche's father died when Friedrich was only 5, so he was raised by his mother and 2 aunts, along with his sister, his younger sister, and grandmother. So he was surrounded by women, and later in life he kind of came to resent that, and some of his writings reflect a little bit of misogyny. But we won't get too much into that. We will just focus on Friedrich the philosopher. He was encouraged to go into theology, but he rejected it and claimed that he lost his faith, and he went into just studying philology, or Greek, and amazingly was offered a professorship when he was only 24 years old. And he tried to fit in, but he just disliked academics. It just was not for him. He referred to professors as ruminants, meaning that most of them are simply regurgitating over and over again the same old stuff, not being creative, not coming up with anything new or progressive. So he didn't quite fit into academics very well, but he did write a lot, and he was very fluid in his writings. And he didn't write like academics. He liked to write more, like stories and interesting parables and that sort of thing. And it was very popular in his time. Unfortunately, as I said, he died about when he's only 56 years old, like his father, of brain diseases. We're not exactly sure what happened, but he was taken for us at an early age. Well, he's probably remembered more for having said that God is dead. And people reject him offhand immediately when they hear that, and that which is unfortunate, because he didn't mean to be some sort of iconoclast that hated religious people. He didn't want to destroy the religious spirit of humanity. He just wanted to sort of bring a corrective, I think, in the same way that if we encountered some very primitive people living off the land and living in caves, and their definition of God was that great entity that controlled the rain, well, we might feel as though we wanted to expand their view of God to include a little more awe, as it were, that God, in fact, not only controls the rain, but the earthquakes and the moons of Saturn and all the galaxies of the universe, as well as the subatomic structure of every atom in the universe, etc. You'd want to expand their idea of God. And so that's sort of what Nietzsche, I think, was trying to say, is that this old-fashioned way of seeing God as just a big person in the sky, that's dead. That's old and needs to be abandoned. Now, I'm not trying to whitewash him or make him into something that he's not. He was not a religious person, and he felt religion had its problems. But he was a person that fought for the liberation, as it were, of people. Well, let's talk a little bit about the background of the religious milieu of his time. At the time when he was studying, Hegel was probably the most prominent and talked about philosopher. And his absolute idealism included a lot of very rationalistic, complex ideas, all linked together in by rationality, and very uh, empty, as it were, of any emotion or any recognition of the more emotional side of life. And thus, many people began to react to this as being just too heady and too lifeless, and thus spawned what we refer to as the Romantic movement in Northern Europe, which was, very popular in Nietzsche's early years. Well, this in turn um, gave a boost to the movement that we refer to as existentialism, which is a recognition of the problems that we have existing as human beings. That if you exist, it doesn't matter when or where on planet Earth, there are certain problems you have to wrestle with, like death, for instance. It's an existential problem. It's a problem that goes hand in hand with existence. And that we have certain existential predicaments as human beings. And one of them being what Nietzsche focused on in a very important way, and what I think is far more important than the fact that he is quoted as saying God is dead. So let's take a look at that. Nietzsche claimed eros, which is very popular to talk about, especially in the Romantic movement. That source of desire that wells up within us, the feelings that get us moving and and flourishing. It's creative and beautiful. It's a source of art. Nietzsche reminds us that, well, it's not only that. It's also, Eros is also uh, the source of that which is destructive, if for no other reason, through the processes of natural selection. I mean, he's quoted as saying, every beautiful and new thing means that something else has been destroyed, is taking its place. And of course, we see this in nature, even amongst like a pride of lions, for instance. One lion works its way to the top by destroying all competitors. And while that seems, harsh, cruel, nature's red in tooth and claw, on the other hand, it strengthens the species, and that it's a very natural thing, and nobody means anything by it. It's just the way to flourishing in life. He refers to it as the will to power. Many had been referring to this as the will to life, but Nietzsche uh, tightens the focus and says it's not just life, it's power. The will to power, to make sure, in other words, that you are going to succeed and survive in life. And he says, and that's our natural purpose. So um, he talks about how some people just seem to naturally be oriented that way, that they have what he referred to as a master morality, or you could even say master mentality, versus other people who have a kind of slave morality or slave mentality, as depicted here in the political cartoon. Um, some people just seize the day, as it were, and try to get the most out of life. And if that means controlling others, then so be it. They have a master morality, and they are seeking the power that is required for success in life. while others have a more slave-like perspective and simply serve those who are doing that. And Nietzsche wanted to say we all really should be trying to develop within us a master morality, because that is our destiny, he thinks. That is what we really should be. Well, he writes this famous book on the genealogy of morals as a way to explain how this all came about. And so a genealogy sort of lists who came from what, right? And when it comes to morals, so what he's going to do is he's going to say, well, where did morals come from? The origin of morals. How did they come about? And he says, well, what the way it came about was uh, people who were weaker began to resent being controlled by powerful people. And because human beings are so clever, so smart, they were able to come up with a way, weaker people were able to come up with a way of controlling people who were actually stronger than them, that had more of a master ability, as it were. And the secret way of doing this was through morality. They would begin to tell people, well, you can't push us around, you can't control us. And the more powerful people would say, well, why is that? And they say, because it isn't right, it isn't moral. Well, who says it isn't moral? And they, of course, would ultimately um, turn to God and say, God says that it isn't right. And because of this little trick, and I'll give you another illustration here in a second, because of this little trick, according to Nietzsche, uh, weaker people began to control the development of humankind and, in fact, thwart it to a certain significant degree. Well, the illustration I like to give is like, imagine that you are in a rowboat, in a lifeboat, as it were, with this guy depicted here, this giant with low intelligence, and your survival supplies are running low, and in fact his are gone. And he looks at you and sees that you still have some, and he thinks to himself that he wants your supplies. And you tell him, well, you can't have them, you need them. And he says, well, he's going to throw you overboard so he can have them. Well, what would you do in that situation? And Nietzsche is suggesting that if you're smart, you will tell him, no, you can't throw me overboard because someone bigger than you will punish you if you do. God will punish you. And that is how someone weaker controls someone stronger, by appealing to the big brother, as it were, who's going to come in and save you, who is God. And that is the source then of morality. He says it's, according to Nietzsche, it's merely a way of weak and resentful people finding a way to control people who are naturally stronger than them. Well, that is probably painting in very broad strokes. That is the main, most important things to carry away from Nietzsche, at least, especially if you have any plans of digging in deeper, which I encourage you to do.